Elizabeth Petrov clutched her small valise tightly as the stagecoach lurched to a halt, dust swirling through the open window and coating her already travel-worn dress. After 6 weeks of travel from Boston to Arizona Territory, she had finally arrived in Gila Bend to meet her future husband, a man she knew only through a handful of letters and a blurry daguerreotype. "Miss, we've arrived," the driver announced gruffly, swinging the door open. "Welcome to Gila Bend." Peering out at the dusty main street lined with wooden buildings, Elizabeth felt her stomach twist with nervous anticipation. The year was 1878, and at 22, she had left behind her life as a seamstress in Boston to answer an advertisement for a bride. Following her parents' deaths from influenza the previous winter, she had found herself alone and struggling to make ends meet. The promise of marriage to Nathan Caldwell, a rancher with good prospects and a gentle disposition according to his letters, had offered her an escape and a chance for a new beginning. As she stepped down from the coach, Elizabeth tried to ignore the curious stares of the townspeople who had gathered to witness the arrival of the Easterner. She smoothed her wrinkled navy traveling dress and adjusted her small hat, suddenly conscious of how out of place she must appear with her pale skin and formal Eastern attire. "I'm looking for Mr. Nathan Caldwell," she said to the stagecoach driver who was unloading her single trunk. "He was to meet me today." The driver exchanged an uncomfortable glance with a nearby townsman. "Caldwell's place is about 3 miles outside of town, miss. Don't see him here, though." A woman in a faded calico dress approached, her expression a mixture of pity and amusement. "You must be the mail-order bride," she said, her voice carrying enough to draw the attention of several other onlookers. "Nathan Caldwell's woman." Elizabeth nodded, clutching her valise tighter. "Yes, I'm Elizabeth Petrov. Mr. Caldwell and I have been corresponding for several months." A ripple of whispers spread through the small crowd. The woman's expression shifted to one of unmistakable discomfort. "Well, miss, I'm afraid you've had a long journey for nothing," a man's voice called out. Sheriff Thomas Parker stepped forward, removing his hat. "Nathan Caldwell passed away 2 weeks ago. Fever took him fast. We sent word east, but I reckon it didn't reach you in time." Elizabeth felt the blood drain from her face. Dead? The man she had traveled across the country to marry was dead? I see," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "I received no such notification. Mail's unreliable out here," the sheriff explained, not unkindly. "Sorry for your trouble, miss." Before Elizabeth could process this devastating news, a voice from the growing crowd called out, "What's a fancy Boston lady going to do now? Go back east where she belongs." Laughter rippled through the onlookers, and Elizabeth felt her cheeks burn with humiliation. "Look at her. Probably never seen dirt before," someone else shouted, eliciting more laughter. "Bet she can't even cook over fire," another added. The sheriff raised his hand to quiet the crowd. "Now, that's enough." The ladies had a shock. But the damage was done. Elizabeth stood frozen, her future crumbling before her eyes as the townspeople continued to make remarks about her Eastern dress, her delicate appearance, and the foolishness of coming to Arizona Territory expecting an easy life. "I've heard tell these mail-order brides think they're getting a mansion and servants," a woman said loudly enough for Elizabeth to hear. "Wait till they see what life's really like out here." "She wouldn't last a week," another agreed. Tears welled in Elizabeth's eyes, but she refused to let them fall. With as much dignity as she could muster, she turned to the sheriff. "Is there somewhere I might stay tonight before I decide what to do next?" "There's the boarding house," he said, gesturing down the street. "Mrs. Wilson runs a clean place." Elizabeth nodded her thanks and began walking in the direction he'd indicated, painfully aware of the continued stares and whispers. Her trunk had been deposited on the boardwalk, and she hesitated, knowing she couldn't carry it herself. "I'll have one of the boys bring your trunk along," the sheriff called after her, seeming to understand her dilemma. As Elizabeth made her way down the dusty main street, the sound of approaching hoofbeats made her turn. A tall man on a chestnut horse pulled up alongside her, dust swirling around his boots as he dismounted in one fluid motion. His face was partially obscured by the brim of his hat, but she could see he was watching her with intense blue eyes. "Pardon me, madam," he said, his voice deep and quiet. "I couldn't help overhearing. You're the lady who came to marry Nathan Caldwell?" Elizabeth stiffened, expecting more mockery. "Yes," she replied simply. The man removed his hat, revealing sun-streaked dark blonde hair and a face tanned by years under the Arizona sun. He appeared to be in his late 20s, with a strong jaw shadowed by a day's growth of beard. "I'm Patrick Chase," he said. "Nate was my neighbor. I was sorry to hear of his passing." Elizabeth nodded, unsure how to respond. This man's manner was different from the others. There was no mockery in his tone, only a genuine kindness that made her throat tighten. "I'm Elizabeth Petrov," she replied, extending her gloved hand out of habit. Patrick hesitated before taking it briefly. "Miss Petrov, I know this isn't my place, but those folks back there don't speak for everyone in Gila Bend. Most are good people, just unaccustomed to newcomers, especially from the east." "Thank you for your kindness, Mr. Chase," Elizabeth said, her voice steadier than she felt. "But I believe I've made a terrible mistake in coming here. I'll be returning east as soon as I can arrange passage." Patrick frowned, his eyes studying her face. "That's a long journey to make twice with nothing to show for it. Might I suggest you take a day or two to rest before deciding?" Elizabeth was about to decline when she realized the practicality of his suggestion. Her funds were limited, and she was exhausted from weeks of travel. Perhaps a night's rest would help her think more clearly. "I suppose that would be wise," she conceded. "I was just headed to Mrs. Wilson's boarding house." "Allow me," Patrick said, taking the valise from her hand. "I'll see you safely there, and have your trunk brought along." As they walked together down the street, Elizabeth felt the stares of the townspeople following them. She held her head high, determined not to show how deeply their ridicule had wounded her. "You'll have to forgive them," Patrick said quietly. "Life out here isn't easy, and folks can be suspicious of outsiders. They forget their manners sometimes." "It seems they forget their humanity as well," Elizabeth replied, unable to keep the bitterness from her voice. Patrick glanced at her, a hint of admiration in his expression. "You have spirit, Miss Petrov. That counts for something out here." They reached the boarding house, a two-story wooden structure with a small porch and neat curtains in the windows. Patrick set down her valise and adjusted his hat. "Mrs. Wilson will take good care of you," he assured her. "And if you need anything while you're in town, my ranch is just north of here, the Pine Ridge spread." Elizabeth thanked him, wondering at his kindness, when the rest of the town had been so quick to mock her. "Mr. Chase," she called as he turned to leave. "Why are you being so kind to me?" Patrick paused, his expression thoughtful. "Nate was a good man. He spoke highly of you in his letters. Said you had courage and grace." He smiled slightly. "And I reckon anyone who crosses half a continent to start a new life deserves at least a neighborly welcome." With that, he tipped his hat and mounted his horse, leaving Elizabeth to ponder his words as she entered the boarding house. Mrs. Wilson proved to be a stern but fair woman in her 50s who showed Elizabeth to a small but clean room on the second floor. After arranging for a bath to be brought up and providing a simple meal, she left Elizabeth to her thoughts. Alone in the unfamiliar room, Elizabeth finally allowed her tears to fall. The humiliation of being laughed at by an entire town, combined with the shock of discovering Nathan's death, overwhelmed her. What was she to do now? Her parents were gone, her position in Boston had been filled, and she had spent most of her savings on the journey west. The prospect of returning east with nothing was almost as daunting as the idea of staying in a place where she was clearly unwelcome. As darkness fell over Gila Bend, Elizabeth made her decision. She would leave at first light, perhaps heading to Tucson or Phoenix, where she might find work as a seamstress until she could save enough to return east. With that resolution made, she fell into an exhausted sleep. Morning arrived with harsh clarity. Elizabeth dressed in her second-best dress, a practical brown wool that would stand up better to travel than yesterday's navy silk. She had just finished packing her few belongings when a knock came at her door. Mrs. Wilson stood in the hallway, her expression unreadable. "There's a gentleman to see you downstairs, Miss Petrov. Mr. Chase." Surprised, Elizabeth followed her downstairs to find Patrick Chase standing in the small parlor, hat in hand. He looked different in the morning light, less intimidating, though no less tall. He wore a clean shirt under his leather vest, and his hair was neatly combed. "Good morning, Miss Petrov," he greeted her. "I trust you slept well?" "As well as could be expected, thank you," she replied, curious about his early visit. Patrick cleared his throat. "I've come to make you a proposition, if you'll hear me out." Elizabeth tensed. In her experience, propositions from men rarely had honorable intentions. Seeing her expression, Patrick quickly continued. "Nothing improper, I assure you. It's just that I was thinking about your situation last night, and I believe I might have a solution that could benefit us both." "I'm listening, Mr. Chase," Elizabeth said cautiously. "I own a small ranch about 5 miles north of town. It's not much yet, but it's growing. I've been in need of a housekeeper, someone to cook and keep things in order while I work the land and cattle." He paused, seemingly gauging her reaction. "I'm offering you employment, Miss Petrov. Room and board plus wages. At least until you decide what you want to do next." Elizabeth stared at him in surprise. "You want me to work for you? But you don't know anything about me." "I could be completely incapable." Patrick smiled slightly. "Nate showed me a few of your letters. You mentioned being handy with a needle and knowing your way around a kitchen. That's more than enough for me. Besides," he added with a hint of humor, "my cooking is liable to kill a man if I keep at it much longer." Elizabeth couldn't help but smile at his candor. The offer was tempting. It would give her time to consider her options while earning money rather than spending it. But propriety was a concern. "It would be highly irregular for me to live alone with an unmarried man, Mr. Chase," she pointed out. "I've thought of that," he replied. "Mrs. Gunderson from the neighboring ranch comes by twice a week to help with laundry. She's a respectable widow of 65 and would vouch for your reputation. And you'd have your own cabin, the old foreman's quarters. It's small but private." Elizabeth hesitated. It was still unconventional, but far more respectable than many alternatives available to a woman alone in the West. And something about Patrick Chase's straightforward manner inspired trust. "How long would this arrangement last?" she asked. 3 months, he suggested. "By then you'll have earned enough to return east comfortably, if that's still your wish. Or..." He trailed off. "Or..." Elizabeth prompted. "Or you might find you like Arizona territory after all," he finished with a small smile. Elizabeth considered the offer. It was certainly better than her hastily formed plan to seek work in an unfamiliar city. And 3 months would give her time to write to her few remaining acquaintances in Boston to inquire about possibilities there. "Very well, Mr. Chase," she said finally. "I accept your offer, on a trial basis. 3 months of employment, after which we'll reassess the situation." Relief crossed Patrick's face. "Excellent. I'll bring the wagon around for your things once you've settled your bill with Mrs. Wilson." An hour later, Elizabeth found herself riding beside Patrick in his wagon, her trunk secured in the back. As they passed through town, she kept her eyes fixed ahead, ignoring the curious stares of the townspeople who had ridiculed her the previous day. "Hold your head high," Patrick said quietly beside her. "You're not running away, you're moving forward." His words gave her a small measure of courage, and Elizabeth straightened her shoulders. She might have come to Gila Bend under false pretenses, but she would not leave in shame. The journey to Pine Ridge Ranch took just over an hour. As they crested a small rise, Elizabeth caught her first glimpse of what would be her home for the next 3 months. A modest log cabin with a covered porch sat nestled against a backdrop of pine trees. A barn and corral stood nearby, along with a smaller cabin that she assumed would be her quarters. The setting was beautiful, with mountains visible in the distance and a small creek winding through the property. "It's not much," Patrick said, sounding almost apologetic. "Nothing like what you'd have had with Nathan. His place was bigger, more established." "It's lovely," Elizabeth replied honestly, surprised by how charming she found the rustic setting. Patrick's eyebrows rose slightly, as if he hadn't expected that response. "Well then," he said, a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth, "welcome to Pine Ridge, Miss Petrov." The next few days were a whirlwind of adjustment for Elizabeth. Her cabin, though small, was clean and private, with a comfortable bed, a small table and chair, and hooks for her limited wardrobe. Patrick's main cabin was larger but Spartan, clearly the dwelling of a man who spent most of his time outdoors. The kitchen was functional but basic, and Elizabeth quickly set about organizing it to her liking. Despite her city upbringing, Elizabeth adapted more quickly than either of them expected. Years of managing a household after her mother's declining health had prepared her for domestic work, and she found satisfaction in bringing order to the ranch house. Her cooking skills, while initially limited to Eastern dishes, expanded as she experimented with the available ingredients and sought advice from Mrs. Gunderson, who proved to be a wealth of information about surviving in the Arizona territory. For his part, Patrick was a fair employer who appreciated her efforts. He worked from dawn till dusk, tending to his small herd of cattle, repairing fences, and breaking new horses. Elizabeth noticed that, unlike many men she had known, he never made her feel that her work was less important than his own. "A ranch needs both," he explained one evening as they ate supper. "The work outside keeps us fed and profitable, but it's the work inside that makes this place a home worth coming back to." A week into her stay, Elizabeth was preparing breakfast when Patrick entered the kitchen looking troubled. "Is everything all right?" she asked, setting a plate of biscuits on the table. Patrick sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Fence on the north pasture is down again. I've got to ride out and fix it, but I'm supposed to be in town today to meet with a cattle buyer." He looked at her speculatively. "How comfortable are you with horses, Miss Petrov?" "I've ridden, though not extensively," she admitted. "Why do you ask?" "I need someone to take some papers into town for me, the deed to 10 head of cattle I'm selling. They need to be at the bank by noon." He hesitated. "I wouldn't ask, but it's important. I could saddle Daisy for you, she's gentle as a lamb." Elizabeth felt a flutter of apprehension at the thought of returning to town alone after her humiliating reception, but she could see that Patrick was in a genuine bind. "Of course," she said with more confidence than she felt. "I'd be happy to help." Relief washed over his face. "Thank you. I'll have Daisy ready in an hour." True to Patrick's word, Daisy proved to be a docile mare who seemed content to amble along the trail to town at a sedate pace. Elizabeth, dressed in her most practical outfit with her hair pinned securely beneath a borrowed hat, found herself enjoying the ride despite her nervousness. The landscape was beautiful in the morning light, with saguaro cacti standing like sentinels against the azure sky and wildflowers dotting the desert floor. As she approached Gila Bend, however, her enjoyment faded, replaced by anxiety about facing the townspeople again. Steeling herself, she rode directly to the bank, determined to complete her errand quickly and return to the ranch. Inside the bank, Elizabeth handed over the papers to Mr. Simmons, the banker, who regarded her with undisguised curiosity. "So you're working for Patrick Chase now?" he asked as he reviewed the documents. "Quite a change from what you expected when you came to marry Nathan Caldwell." "Life rarely turns out as we expect, Mr. Simmons," Elizabeth replied evenly. "I'm fortunate that Mr. Chase offered me employment until I decide my next steps." The banker's eyebrows rose. "Chase is a good man. Hard-working. built that ranch from nothing after coming back from the war. He stamped the documents and handed her a receipt. Not the easiest man to get to know, though. Keeps to himself mostly. Elizabeth tucked the receipt into her pocket, intrigued by this glimpse into Patrick's past but unwilling to gossip about her employer. "Thank you for your assistance, Mr. Simmons. Good day." As she stepped out onto the boardwalk, Elizabeth nearly collided with two women she recognized from her arrival day. They stopped their conversation abruptly, eyeing her with open curiosity. "Well, if it isn't the mail-order bride," one said, her tone less mocking than before but still pointed. "Heard you're keeping house for Patrick Chase now." "I am employed by Mr. Chase, yes," Elizabeth confirmed, moving to step around them. "Didn't take you long to find another situation," the second woman remarked. Some might wonder at a single lady moving out to a bachelor's ranch so quickly. Elizabeth felt her cheeks flush with anger. "Some might do better to mind their own affairs rather than speculating about others," she replied sharply. "Good day, ladies." As she untied Daisy from the hitching post, Elizabeth heard a chuckle behind her. Turning, she found Sheriff Parker watching her with amusement. "You've got spirit, Miss Petrov," he said approvingly. "Don't let Mabel and Francis bother you. They'd gossip about the wind if it blew from an unusual direction." Elizabeth smiled despite herself. "Thank you, Sheriff. I'm learning that small towns have their own challenges." "That they do," he agreed. "But they have their advantages too, once folks get to know you." He tipped his hat. "Give my regards to Patrick. Good man, Chase." As Elizabeth rode back to Pine Ridge Ranch, she found herself pondering the sheriff's words and the banker's comments about Patrick. She had been working alongside him for a week, but realized she knew very little about the man who had offered her sanctuary when the rest of the town had laughed her away. When she returned to the ranch, she found Patrick mending a saddle on the porch. He looked up as she approached, relief evident in his expression. "You're back safely," he said, standing to help her dismount. "How did it go?" "The papers are delivered, and here's your receipt," she replied, handing it to him. "Your banker seems to think highly of you." Patrick looked surprised. "Simmons?" "He's a fair man, though tight with money. Did you have any trouble in town?" Elizabeth considered telling him about the women's insinuations, but decided against it. "Nothing I couldn't handle," she said instead. "People were curious about my new situation, that's all." Patrick studied her face, seeming to sense there was more to the story, but he didn't press. "Well, I appreciate your help. Not many city ladies would have ridden into town alone after the welcome you received." "Perhaps I'm more adaptable than I appear," Elizabeth suggested with a small smile. Patrick's expression warmed. "I'm beginning to see that, Miss Petrov." Over the next few weeks, a comfortable routine developed at Pine Ridge Ranch. Elizabeth rose early to prepare breakfast, then spent her mornings cleaning, cooking, and tending to the small kitchen garden she had started. Patrick worked with the cattle and horses, repaired fencing, and made improvements to the buildings. They took their midday meals separately most days, with Elizabeth leaving a plate for Patrick while she ate in her cabin. Evenings, however, they shared supper in the main cabin, gradually becoming more at ease in each other's company. Elizabeth found herself looking forward to these evening conversations. Patrick, though initially reserved, proved to be well-read and thoughtful. He had fought for the Union in the Civil War, she learned, and had come west afterwards seeking a fresh start. He spoke of his dreams for the ranch expanding the herd, improving the bloodlines of his horses, perhaps planting an orchard where the soil was richest near the creek. "What about you?" he asked one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the desert in shades of gold and crimson. "What were your dreams before you decided to come west?" Elizabeth considered the question. "I suppose I wanted what most women want: a home, a family, work that matters." She smiled ruefully. "Though I never imagined finding those things in Arizona territory." "And now?" Patrick asked quietly. "What do you want now?" The question caught Elizabeth off guard. What did she want? The certainty with which she had planned to return east was wavering. She had come to appreciate the beauty of this harsh landscape, the satisfaction of hard work, and the simple rhythms of ranch life. And then there was Patrick himself, his quiet strength, his kindness, the way his rare smile transformed his face. "I'm not sure anymore," she admitted. "Everything has changed so quickly." Patrick nodded, his eyes on the distant mountains. "Life has a way of taking unexpected turns." After a moment, he added, "For what it's worth, you've brought something special to Pine Ridge. The place feels different with you here. Better." Elizabeth felt her heart quicken at his words, but before she could respond, the sound of approaching horses drew their attention. 3 riders were coming up the trail, moving fast. Patrick stood, his posture suddenly tense. "Stay here," he instructed, stepping off the porch as the riders approached. Elizabeth recognized the men as they drew closer, all regulars at the Gila Bend saloon, and none with good reputations. The leader, a burly man named Harkins, pulled his horse to a stop a few yards from Patrick. "Evening, Chase," Harkins called, his tone falsely friendly. "Thought we'd pay a social call, seeing as you've got yourself some fine company these days." Patrick's voice was calm, but carried an edge of steel. "This isn't a good time for visiting, Harkins. Why don't you boys head back to town?" Harkins laughed, a harsh sound that sent a chill down Elizabeth's spine. "Now that's not very neighborly. We rode all this way just to say hello to the mail-order bride." His eyes shifted to Elizabeth on the porch. "Heard she got laughed right out of town before you snatched her up. Figured we'd see what all the fuss was about." Elizabeth felt her face burn with humiliation, but she held her ground, meeting Harkins's gaze steadily. "You've had your look," Patrick said coldly. "Now I suggest you leave. My hospitality doesn't extend to uninvited guests with no manners." "No manners?" One of the other men slurred, clearly drunk. "That's rich coming from a man living in sin with a woman he ain't married to." Elizabeth gasped at the crude accusation, but before she could speak, Patrick had stepped forward, his hand resting casually near the pistol at his hip. "That's enough," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "Miss Petrov is my employee and a lady deserving of respect. I won't have her name sullied by drunken fools. Now ride out, or things will get unpleasant." Something in Patrick's demeanor must have convinced Harkins of his seriousness, for after a tense moment, he shrugged and turned his horse. "Come on, boys." Chase wants to keep his fancy woman to himself. Can't say I blame him. The 3 men rode away, their laughter floating back on the evening breeze. Elizabeth stood frozen on the porch, mortified by their words and implications. Patrick watched until they were out of sight before turning back to her, his expression troubled. "I'm sorry about that," he said quietly. "Harkins and his kind enjoy causing trouble. Try not to let their words bother you." But Elizabeth was already thinking of the women in town, of the gossip that must be spreading, of her reputation being questioned. "Perhaps it was a mistake for me to stay here," she said, her voice unsteady. "I never considered how it might appear." Patrick frowned. "You've done nothing wrong. We have a business arrangement, nothing more." "But people will talk," Elizabeth insisted. "They already are. Your own reputation could suffer because of my presence here." "I don't give a damn about gossip," Patrick replied firmly. "And neither should you. We know the truth of things between us." "The truth of things?" Elizabeth felt a pang at his words, realizing with startling clarity that her feelings for Patrick had grown beyond those of employee to employer. Somehow, in the weeks she had spent at Pine Ridge, she had come to care for this quiet, honorable man far more than was wise. "All the same," she said, struggling to keep her voice even, "perhaps it would be best if I found other employment. In Phoenix, perhaps, or Tucson." Patrick's expression darkened. "Is that what you want? To leave?" "No," Elizabeth thought. It's the last thing I want. But how could she admit that? How could she tell this man who had offered her shelter and employment out of kindness that she was falling in love with him? I think it might be for the best, she said instead, unable to meet his eyes. Patrick was silent for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was carefully controlled. If that's your decision, I'll respect it. You've more than earned your wages, and I'll provide a letter of recommendation attesting to your character and abilities. Elizabeth nodded, feeling strangely empty despite having made what she knew was the sensible choice. Thank you. I'll plan to leave at the end of the week, if that suits. As you wish, Patrick replied, his expression unreadable as he turned and walked toward the barn, leaving Elizabeth alone with her conflicted thoughts. The next few days passed in strained politeness. Elizabeth continued her duties, but the easy companionship she had shared with Patrick was gone, replaced by formal interactions and awkward silences. She packed her belongings slowly, each item a reminder of the life she had begun to build at Pine Ridge Ranch, a life she was now choosing to leave behind. On her final evening at the ranch, Elizabeth prepared a special meal as a gesture of gratitude. She used the best of their supplies to create a feast of roast chicken, fresh bread, and apple pie made with dried apples she had carefully hoarded. Patrick arrived for supper on time, freshly washed and wearing a clean shirt. If he was surprised by the elaborate meal, he didn't show it, merely thanking her quietly as they sat down to eat. They ate in silence until Patrick finally set down his fork. "This is ridiculous," he said abruptly. "We can't even talk to each other anymore." Elizabeth looked up, startled by his outburst. I thought it might be easier this way." "Easier?" Patrick's eyes held hers. "There's nothing easy about watching you prepare to leave. Nothing easy about trying to imagine this place without you in it." Elizabeth's heart began to race. "What are you saying, Patrick?" He pushed back his chair and stood, pacing the small kitchen. "I'm saying I made a mistake. When I offered you employment, I told myself I was just being neighborly, doing what Nate would have wanted. But that wasn't the whole truth." Elizabeth held her breath, afraid to hope. Patrick stopped pacing and faced her. "The truth is, I saw you that day in town standing there with your head held high while those fools laughed at you, and I thought you were the bravest, most beautiful woman I'd ever laid eyes on. I couldn't bear to see you leave then, and I can't bear it now." "Patrick," Elizabeth began, but he held up a hand. "Please let me finish. These past weeks, having you here, it's changed everything. The way you've made this place a home, the way you face each new challenge head on, the way you make me want to be a better man." He took a deep breath. "I know this isn't what you came west for. You came to be a wife, not a housekeeper. But I find myself hoping, wondering if you might consider staying, not as my employee, but as my wife." Elizabeth sat perfectly still, scarcely believing what she was hearing. "Are you proposing to me?" Patrick knelt before her chair, taking her hands in his. "I am. I love you, Elizabeth Petrov. I think I've loved you since the moment I saw you walking down that street with your head held high despite having your heart broken. I know it's sudden, and I know I'm not the man you came here to marry. I have no fortune to offer, just a small ranch and a lifetime of hard work ahead. But I can promise to cherish you every day of my life, if you'll have me." Tears filled Elizabeth's eyes, but they were tears of joy. "Oh, Patrick. When I first came to Gila Bend, I thought my world had ended. Everything I'd planned, everything I'd hoped for seemed lost." She squeezed his hands. "But now I see that fate was leading me exactly where I needed to be to you." Hope dawned in Patrick's eyes. "Is that a yes?" Elizabeth laughed through her tears. "Yes, Patrick Chase. Yes, I will marry you." Patrick's face broke into the most radiant smile she had ever seen. He pulled her to her feet and into his arms, holding her as if she were the most precious thing in the world. When their lips met, Elizabeth knew with absolute certainty that she had found her home. They were married 2 weeks later in Gila Bend's small church, with Sheriff Parker and Mrs. Gunderson as witnesses. To Elizabeth's surprise, many of the townspeople attended, including some who had mocked her on her arrival. It seemed that Patrick's respect in the community, combined with the romantic story of their courtship, had softened even the harshest critics. After the ceremony, as they rode back to Pine Ridge Ranch as husband and wife, Patrick pulled his horse alongside Elizabeth's. "Happy?" he asked, his eyes crinkling at the corners. Elizabeth looked at the man who had ridden after her when everyone else had laughed, the man who had seen her worth when she doubted it herself, the man who was now her husband. "More than I ever dreamed possible," she replied truthfully. As Pine Ridge Ranch came into view, Elizabeth felt a profound sense of homecoming. This place that had once seemed so foreign was now the center of her world. And as Patrick helped her down from her horse and carried her across the threshold of their home, she knew that what had begun as the most humiliating day of her life had led her to the greatest happiness she had ever known. In the years that followed, Pine Ridge Ranch prospered under their joint care. Their family grew with the addition of 2 sons and a daughter. Elizabeth never regretted her decision to stay in Arizona Territory, nor did she forget how close she had come to leaving. Sometimes, on quiet evenings as they sat together on the porch watching the sunset, she would remind Patrick of how he had ridden after the laughed-out mail-order bride and asked her to stay. "Best decision I ever made," he would always reply, pulling her close against his side. And Elizabeth, thinking of the journey that had brought her from humiliation to joy, could only agree. Sometimes, she reflected, the wrong road could lead to exactly the right destination if you were brave enough to keep going and fortunate enough to find someone willing to ride alongside you.